Were people in the medieval age truly at the mercy of their own bodies, constantly battling unseen invaders? Did a cough spell a death sentence, or a rash mark you for life? From the years 500 to 1500, daily life was a relentless struggle against sickness, a stark contrast to our world of doctors and pharmacies. Number 10. Ringworm and fungal infections. Life in the medieval age was often lived in close quarters, with limited access to clean water and an understanding of basic hygiene far removed from what we know today. This combination created a fertile ground for a range of persistent, uncomfortable, and sometimes disfiguring skin conditions, among the most common being ringworm and other fungal infections. It was not a grand plague that swept through cities with dramatic death tolls, but rather a constant, itchy, and unsightly companion for many. Ringworm, despite its name, is not caused by a worm at all, but by a type of fungus. Medieval people called it tinea, and they certainly recognized its distinct circular rash. Historical records and illustrations from the time show people with these telltale red, scaly, and intensely itchy patches on their skin. The edges of the rash often looked like a raised ring, leading to its common name. This fungus could appear on various parts of the body. When it appeared on the scalp, it was called tinea capitis, and it often led to patches of hair loss on the body. It was tinea corporis. It could also affect the feet, leading to what we now call athlete's foot, or the groin area, causing jock itch. In a time before daily showers and fresh changes of clothes were common for everyone, these fungi thrived. The way ringworm spread was simple and effective. In the medieval environment, it was highly contagious. Direct skin-to-skin contact was a primary way it moved from person to person. Sharing bedding, clothing, or even tools could also transmit the fungal spores. Animals were another source. People lived in very close proximity to livestock, such as cows, sheep, and pigs, and even household pets like dogs and cats. Many of these animals carried fungal infections that could jump to humans. A family sharing a single bed, children playing closely together, or villagers huddling for warmth in a communal space would unknowingly pass these irritating fungi around. There was no concept of sterilization or disinfection as we understand it. Clothes were washed infrequently and often in shared, possibly contaminated water sources. Personal hygiene practices were often rudimentary, limited by available water and soap, which was a luxury for many. The symptoms of ringworm were more than just an annoyance. The persistent itching could be maddening, disrupting sleep, and making daily tasks difficult. The visible rash, especially on the face or hands, could lead to social discomfort. While not usually fatal, severe cases could lead to secondary bacterial infections if the skin was broken from constant scratching. Such secondary infections, in a time without antibiotics, could become serious, leading to cellulitis or even more generalized infections. A medieval person suffering from widespread ringworm on their scalp might experience significant hair loss and discomfort, making them stand out in their community. Children were particularly susceptible, as their immune systems were still developing, and they often engaged in rough and tumble play, increasing skin contact. Medieval treatments for ringworm were a mix of observation and traditional remedies. Healers and wise women would often recognize the distinct rash. Some common approaches involved applying various herbal concoctions to the affected area. Garlic, known for its antifungal properties, was sometimes crushed and applied topically. Vinegar, with its acidic nature, was also used, as was salt mixed with other ingredients. Honey, too, was a common ingredient in many remedies, valued for its purported healing properties. People might also try to scrape the affected skin or apply hot compresses to try and burn out the infection. Folk medicine often incorporated elements from nature, and some medieval texts describe remedies using substances like ash, sulfur, or even animal fats mixed with herbs. Prayer and religious rituals were also common alongside these physical treatments, as many ailments were seen through a spiritual lens. There was no understanding of hygiene as a preventative measure for such conditions. People did not connect the sharing of combs or the infrequent washing of linen to the spread of these fungi. They simply dealt with the symptoms as best they could, enduring the itch and the visible signs of infection as an unfortunate part of life. Ringworm was a constant reminder of the difficult living conditions and the limited medical knowledge of the era. It was a persistent, uncomfortable truth of medieval existence, an ailment that might not kill, but could certainly make life miserable and visually distinct. Number 9. Scabies. Imagine a persistent, invisible tormentor burrowing beneath your skin, causing an incessant itch that nothing seemed to relieve. That was the grim reality for countless people in the medieval age who suffered from scabies. Unlike the dramatic symptoms of other diseases, scabies was a microscopic invasion, a silent epidemic of discomfort that thrived in the crowded, unhygienic conditions of medieval life. It was a skin infestation caused by tiny mites, Sarcoptes scabies, which burrowed into the top layer of the skin to lay their eggs. The intense itching was not from the mites themselves, but an allergic reaction of the human body to the mites, their eggs, and their waste products. The symptoms of scabies were relentless and deeply unpleasant. The most prominent symptom was an overwhelming, almost maddening itch, which often worsened at night. This made sleep difficult and disturbed, further weakening people who were already struggling with poor nutrition or other illnesses. Upon closer inspection, medieval sufferers might have noticed small raised red bumps, often resembling pimples, or tiny burrows in their skin. These burrows appeared as thin, wavy lines, slightly raised and grayish-white. Common areas for these rashes included the webs of fingers and toes, wrists, elbows, armpits, genitals, and the skin around the navel. For infants and young children, scabies could spread to the scalp, face, neck, palms, and soles of the feet. The constant scratching, an almost involuntary reaction to the torment, often led to secondary bacterial infections. Open sores, crusts, and weeping skin lesions were common, creating entry points for more serious bacterial invaders like Staphylococcus or Streptococcus, which in an age without antibiotics could lead to cellulitis, impetigo, or even more generalized infections like sepsis, posing a real threat to life. The spread of scabies was directly linked to the communal and often unsanitary living arrangements of the medieval period. The mites are primarily transmitted through prolonged skin-to-skin contact, making families living in small, cramped homes particularly vulnerable. Sharing beds was common, not just within families, but sometimes even among servants or travelers in inns. Shared clothing, blankets, and towels also served as vectors for the tiny mites. Public spaces like churches, markets, and communal baths, where people gathered in close proximity, could also facilitate transmission. There was no understanding of hygiene as a preventative measure for such conditions. People did not connect the sharing of combs or the infrequent washing of linen to the spread of these mites. In medieval society, where entire families often slept in one room, sometimes even sharing bedding with livestock for warmth, the opportunities for direct transmission were countless. The infrequent washing of clothes and bodies, due to limited access to clean water or the sheer labor involved in washing, further perpetuated the cycle of infestation. Medieval healers and laypeople recognized the distinct persistent itching and the appearance of rashes. They did not, of course, know about microscopic mites. They might have attributed the condition to bad humors in the blood, an imbalance in the body's essential fluids, or even a divine punishment. Treatments were varied and often aimed at alleviating the symptoms rather than eradicating the cause. Sulfur was a commonly used remedy. It was often mixed with animal fat or oil to create an ointment that would be applied to the skin. Sulfur was known to have antiparasitic properties, and it probably offered some relief, though it would have been messy and strong-smelling. Other remedies included various herbal concoctions, often with ingredients thought to be repellent or soothing. Garlic, vinegar, and certain tree saps were also used. Some treatments involved bathing in specific solutions or applying poultices made from plants. Hot baths, when available, might have offered temporary relief from the itching and helped clean the skin, but they would not eliminate the mites. The constant scratching meant people often looked unsightly with visible sores and raw skin. This could lead to social ostracism, as people often feared what they did not understand, associating skin conditions with moral failings or infectious diseases. Children and the elderly were often the most severely affected, their bodies less able to cope with the constant irritation and secondary infections. Scabies was a silent, agonizing epidemic, a constant reminder of the harsh realities of medieval life where comfort was a luxury and pervasive discomfort a daily companion. Number 8. Influenza. In the medieval age, a disease that arrived swiftly, often in seasonal waves, causing widespread fever, coughs, and body aches, was influenza. While not always as deadly as the bubonic plague, influenza epidemics were frequent and could still cause significant mortality, especially among the young, the elderly, and those already weakened by other ailments or malnutrition. It was a familiar pattern of illness, yet its true cause remained a mystery, often attributed to bad air or astrological influences. People did not distinguish between different types of fever-inducing illnesses, so influenza was often lumped together with other respiratory infections under general terms like agues or pestilential fevers. The symptoms of influenza in medieval times were consistent with what we recognize today: a sudden onset of fever, often accompanied by chills, a severe headache, muscle aches all over the body, fatigue, and a distinct cough. The cough could be dry or productive, and often became severe, leading to chest pain. Sore throats, runny noses, and sneezing were also common. For many, these symptoms would resolve after a few days, leaving them weak but recovering. However, for a significant portion of the population, especially those with compromised immune systems or pre-existing conditions, influenza could quickly turn deadly. The primary cause of death was often secondary bacterial pneumonia, as the viral infection weakened the lungs, making them vulnerable to bacterial invasion. In a time without antibiotics, bacterial pneumonia was a formidable killer. A person weakened by influenza might also succumb to other diseases. Their body could no longer fight off. The spread of influenza was rapid and widespread. It traveled easily from person to person through respiratory droplets released during coughing or sneezing. In medieval cities and towns where people lived in close proximity, often in crowded dwellings with poor ventilation, the virus could spread like wildfire. Markets, churches, and public gatherings were ideal breeding grounds for transmission. Trade routes, pilgrimage paths, and military campaigns served as highways for the virus, carrying it from one region to another. A person who was sick might travel to a new town before symptoms were severe, unknowingly spreading the virus to a fresh population. Because it was seasonal, often appearing in the colder months, people would huddle indoors for warmth, further increasing the chances of transmission. The lack of understanding about contagion meant no precautions were taken to prevent its spread. There was no concept of quarantining sick individuals or practicing respiratory etiquette. The impact of widespread influenza outbreaks was significant. While individual mortality might be lower than the plague, the sheer number of people affected meant that daily life could grind to a halt. Laborers might be too sick to work, farmers too ill to tend their fields, and merchants too weak to travel. This could lead to temporary shortages of food and goods, disrupting local economies. Schools, if they existed, would empty, and social gatherings would cease. The number of dead, while not always recorded with the same precision as plague victims, still represented a substantial loss of life over time. Chronicles sometimes mention years of great sicknesses or fevers that swept through populations, which likely included influenza outbreaks. The medieval worldview often attributed such widespread illnesses to divine displeasure, an imbalance of the four humors or astrological conjunctions. Medieval treatments for influenza focused on managing symptoms and balancing the humors. Bloodletting was a common practice, believed to remove bad blood that was causing the fever. Purging through emetics or laxatives was also used to expel perceived toxins from the body. Herbal remedies were widely employed to alleviate symptoms. Ginger and cinnamon for warmth and to combat chills, elderflower for fevers, and various soothing concoctions for coughs. Rest and warmth were often advised, and nourishing broths were given to the sick. Prayers and religious rituals were also important, with people seeking divine intervention for recovery. There was no specific cure, and people simply had to ride out the illness, hoping their body's strength would be enough to overcome it. Those who survived often emerged weakened, sometimes for weeks or even months, vulnerable to other infections. Influenza was a constant, unpredictable threat, a reminder of the fragility of life in a world without modern medicine. It was a familiar foe that continually reshaped communities, taking lives and leaving widespread disruption in its wake. Number 7. Typhus fever. In the packed, often filthy conditions of medieval towns and armies, another silent killer frequently emerged: typhus fever. This disease was closely tied to poverty, overcrowding, and a lack of sanitation, thriving where people, their clothing, and their surroundings were infested with lice. Unlike some diseases that arrived in sudden dramatic waves, typhus was often a companion of hardship, following in the wake of war, famine, or siege, or simply lingering in the most deprived corners of society. It was a bacterial infection spread by body lice, a fact completely unknown to medieval people, who instead linked its outbreaks to general squalor or divine judgment. The symptoms of typhus were severe and debilitating. A person would typically experience a sudden onset of high fever, often reaching dangerous levels, accompanied by intense headaches that could be excruciating. Chills and muscle aches were common, as was a generalized feeling of extreme weakness and confusion. A distinctive rash, typically reddish-brown spots, would often appear on the trunk of the body and then spread to the limbs, though it usually spared the face, palms, and soles. As the disease progressed, mental status could rapidly deteriorate, leading to delirium, stupor, and even coma. Some sufferers experienced respiratory problems, including pneumonia-like symptoms and circulatory issues that could lead to gangrene of the extremities. Without treatment, mortality rates for typhus could be alarmingly high, ranging from 10% to 40% or even more during severe epidemics. Survivors often faced a long and difficult recovery, sometimes with lasting neurological effects. The spread of typhus was inextricably linked to the presence of human body lice. These tiny parasites lived in clothing and on the skin, and they became infected with the Rickettsia prawazici bacteria after feeding on an infected person. When an infected louse bit a healthy person, or more commonly when the louse's feces were scratched into a bite wound or mucous membrane, the bacteria entered the bloodstream. The conditions of medieval life were ideal for lice infestations. Personal hygiene was rudimentary for most people. Bathing was infrequent, and clothing was rarely washed or changed. especially among the poor. Clothes were often worn continuously for weeks or months, providing a perfect habitat for lice to breed. Overcrowding in homes, prisons, military camps, and refugee centers meant that lice could easily move from person to person. During times of war, soldiers packed into barracks or on campaigns, often sharing uniforms and bedding, were particularly susceptible to massive outbreaks, leading to camp fever or jail fever, terms that likely referred to typhus. The siege of Granada in 1489 to 1492, for example, saw more Spanish soldiers die from typhus than from enemy action. Medieval understanding of typhus was like many diseases based on observable patterns rather than microscopic causes. They recognized that it appeared in crowded, unsanitary places, leading to the belief that it was caused by miasmas or noxious fumes arising from filth and decaying matter. This observation was partially correct in that filth correlated with lice, but the true mechanism was unknown. Treatments were largely symptomatic and often included practices like bloodletting or purging to rebalance the humors, which offered no benefit and often weakened the patient further. Herbal remedies were used to reduce fever or promote sweating. Efforts might be made to improve ventilation, as people believed bad air was the cause. Good nursing care, providing warmth, fluids, and some basic comfort would have been the most effective treatment, though even this was often lacking for the poorest sufferers. Religious devotion and prayer were also common responses, as the disease was often viewed as a divine punishment. Typhus was a disease that preyed on the most vulnerable, reflecting the harsh realities of poverty, conflict, and a complete absence of public health infrastructure. Its constant presence was a grim reminder of how easily life could be cut short by unseen enemies thriving in the very fabric of daily existence. Number 6. Ergotism, St. Anthony's fire. Among the more terrifying and bizarre ailments of the medieval age was ergotism, a disease born directly from the staple food of many Europeans, rye bread. This condition, often called St. Anthony's fire, was a consequence of consuming rye grain contaminated with a fungus known as claviceps purpurea, or ergot. The fungus produced toxic alkaloids that, when ingested, caused a range of horrific symptoms, from excruciating pain and gangrene to terrifying hallucinations and convulsions. It was an unpredictable and often fatal affliction, striking communities seemingly at random, leading to widespread panic and spiritual interpretations. Ergotism manifested in two primary forms, each equally dreadful. The first, gangrenous ergotism, was characterized by an agonizing burning sensation in the limbs, as if the victim's flesh was being consumed by fire. This sensation was so intense that it led to the common name, St. Anthony's fire, as people often sought the intercession of St. Anthony, patron saint of skin diseases and fire, for relief. As the disease progressed, blood vessels in the extremities would constrict, cutting off blood supply to the fingers, toes, hands, and feet. This lack of blood flow led to the death of tissues, causing gangrene. The affected limbs would turn black, shrivel, and often fall off without any bleeding, a truly horrifying spectacle. The pain was often so unbearable that victims would sometimes plead for amputation. The second form, convulsive ergotism, attacked the nervous system. Symptoms included painful muscle spasms, violent convulsions, tremors, and severe headaches. Victims might experience crawling sensations on their skin, intense itching, and seizures. Perhaps most unsettling were the psychological effects. Hallucinations, delusions, mania, and psychosis were common. People suffering from convulsive ergotism might dance uncontrollably, scream incoherently, or appear to be possessed by demons, their minds lost to the toxic effects of the fungus. This form often led to death from exhaustion or complications during seizures. Both forms of ergotism could be fatal, and those who survived were often left permanently disfigured or neurologically impaired. The cause of ergotism was a complete mystery to medieval people. They simply knew that it struck when the rye harvest was poor, particularly after wet springs followed by hot summers, conditions favorable for the ergot fungus to grow on the rye heads. Rye was the primary grain for bread in much of Europe, especially among the peasant classes. When the contaminated grain was harvested and milled into flour, the toxins became incorporated into the daily bread that people consumed. The poor were most vulnerable because they relied heavily on rye and often could not afford to discard spoiled grain. Communities could be devastated. Historical chronicles contain numerous accounts of outbreaks. One of the most famous occurred in France in 944 AD, where thousands died from the holy fire. Another major outbreak happened in the Rhine Valley in 1096. Monasteries dedicated to Saint Anthony, like the one at La Motte-aux-Bois, became centers for caring for victims, sometimes offering herbal remedies or specialized diets, but often simply providing comfort and spiritual solace. Medieval beliefs surrounding ergotism were deeply rooted in spiritual and superstitious interpretations. Given the agonizing pain, gangrene, and particularly the neurological and psychological symptoms, many believed victims were suffering from divine punishment, witchcraft, or demonic possession. The convulsive form in particular could lead to accusations of demonic influence, further marginalizing sufferers. Treatments were largely ineffective because the true cause was unknown. Healers might try applying poultices, administering pain, relieving herbs, or performing bloodletting. Prayer, pilgrimages, and the veneration of Saint Anthony were common, as people desperately sought spiritual intervention. The only true cure was to stop consuming the contaminated rye, a solution that was stumbled upon rather than scientifically discovered. When a community recognized a connection between the new harvest and the outbreak, they might switch to other grains if available, or simply discard the affected rye. But this understanding was not consistent or widespread. Ergotism was a terrifying and gruesome illustration of how closely tied medieval health was to the agricultural cycle and the purity of their most basic foodstuff, a constant reminder of the unseen dangers lurking in their daily bread. Number 5. Tuberculosis, consumption. In the Mesozoic age, a persistent, insidious killer stalked populations known by its devastating effect, consumption. Today, we call it tuberculosis or TB. It was a disease that slowly wasted away its victims, leading to a long, drawn-out decline that was often romanticized in later eras but was a brutal reality for medieval sufferers. Unlike the sudden, catastrophic outbreaks of plague, consumption was a steady, omnipresent threat, quietly claiming lives over months or even years, especially among the young and those weakened by poverty or other illnesses. Its microscopic cause, the Mycobacterium tuberculosis bacterium, was of course utterly unknown. The symptoms of consumption were a cruel progression. It typically began with a persistent hacking cough that often produced phlegm, and later blood. This cough could be debilitating, leading to exhaustion and chest pain. As the disease advanced, victims would experience a gradual but relentless wasting away of their bodies, hence the name consumption. They would lose weight dramatically, becoming emaciated and frail, their bones becoming prominent under their skin. Fevers, particularly low-grade fevers that spiked in the afternoon or evening, were common, accompanied by drenching night sweats that left clothes and bedding soaked. A general feeling of malaise, weakness, and loss of appetite contributed to the decline. If the lungs were severely damaged, breathing would become increasingly difficult, leading to shortness of breath. While most commonly affecting the lungs, pulmonary tuberculosis, the bacterium could also spread to other parts of the body, causing symptoms like swollen lymph nodes, scrofula, often called king's evil, and believed to be curable by royal touch, bone pain, joint deformities, and even neurological issues if it affected the brain or spine. Death often came from severe lung damage, respiratory failure, or widespread organ failure. The spread of tuberculosis was primarily through airborne droplets. When an infected person coughed, sneezed, or even spoke, tiny droplets containing the bacteria were released into the air. Others nearby could then inhale these droplets. The close living quarters, poor ventilation, and crowded conditions characteristic of medieval towns, monasteries, and even peasant homes were ideal for the spread of this airborne pathogen. Families often lived and slept in one room, sharing air in confined spaces. Lack of understanding about contagion meant no attempts were made to isolate the sick. Shared eating utensils, though less of a factor than airborne spread, could also contribute. People who were chronically ill and coughing for long periods became potent sources of infection for those around them. Poverty and malnutrition exacerbated the problem. Weakened immune systems made people more susceptible to contracting the disease and less able to fight it off once infected. Archaeological evidence from medieval burial sites often shows skeletal signs of tuberculosis, particularly in the spine and joints, indicating its pervasive presence throughout the population. Medieval beliefs about consumption were varied. Some thought it was hereditary, running in families, an observation that was partly true as families living together were more likely to share the infection. Others believed it was caused by an imbalance of the four humors, particularly an excess of phlegm or melancholy. It was also sometimes seen as a spiritual affliction or a punishment for sin. The slow, lingering nature of the disease sometimes led to its being associated with poetic suffering, especially for the young and beautiful, giving rise to its romantic image in later centuries. But this was far from the brutal reality. For those actually suffering, treatments were largely ineffective. Bloodletting and purging were common, as were herbal remedies aimed at strengthening the patient or alleviating specific symptoms like the cough. Rest, good food, and fresh air were sometimes prescribed for those who could afford it, which aligns with modern understanding of supportive care. But these were luxuries for most. People also sought cures through spiritual means, such as prayer, pilgrimages, or seeking the royal touch from monarchs for scrofula. Despite these efforts, consumption continued its relentless march, a constant presence in medieval society, a reminder that death could come slowly and agonizingly, not just swiftly and dramatically. It was a silent, pervasive tragedy, eroding individual lives and communities year after year. Number 4. Dysentery. In the medieval age, amidst the challenges of poor sanitation and contaminated water, a relentless and often deadly foe loomed: dysentery. It was not a single disease, but a group of infectious diarrheal illnesses, often caused by bacteria like Shigella, bacillary dysentery, or parasites like entamoeba, histolytica, amoebic dysentery. No matter the specific cause, the outcome was similar: severe, painful diarrhea, often containing blood and mucus, leading to rapid dehydration and death. Dysentery outbreaks were particularly common during sieges, military campaigns, and periods of famine. But they were also a constant threat in crowded towns and villages where basic hygiene was virtually non-existent. It earned the grim nickname the Bloody Flux for a very clear and terrifying reason. The symptoms of dysentery were unmistakable and horrifying. The primary symptom was frequent, watery bowel movements, often containing visible blood, mucus, and pus. This was accompanied by severe abdominal cramps, intense pain, and tenesmus, a constant painful urge to pass stool even when the bowels were empty. Fever, nausea, vomiting, and a general feeling of weakness were also common. The rapid and massive loss of fluids and electrolytes through diarrhea and vomiting quickly led to severe dehydration. In a time when intravenous fluids were unheard of, Dehydration was a major killer, especially for infants, young children, and the elderly, whose bodies struggled to maintain fluid balance. A person could go from seemingly well to gravely ill within a day or two. If left untreated, the disease could cause organ failure, seizures, or even death, particularly from dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. Chronic dysentery could also lead to severe malnutrition as the body struggled to absorb nutrients. The spread of dysentery was a direct consequence of the unsanitary living conditions prevalent throughout the medieval period. The primary route of transmission was the fecal-oral route. This meant that the bacteria or parasites causing the disease were shed in the feces of infected individuals and then somehow ingested by others. This could happen through contaminated food or water. Water sources, whether rivers, wells, or cisterns, were frequently polluted by human and animal waste. Latrines were often crude pits or simply open areas, and waste often flowed into rivers or streams that also served as drinking water sources. Food preparation often involved unwashed hands, and flies, attracted to filth, could easily transfer pathogens from human waste to food. Public hygiene was virtually non-existent. Streets were often open sewers, and waste was frequently dumped directly outside homes. Armies on the march, living in close quarters and with poor sanitation, were particularly vulnerable to devastating dysentery outbreaks, which often claimed more lives than battle wounds. During sieges, when access to fresh water and food was limited and sanitation broke down completely, dysentery could decimate entire garrisons or besieged populations. Medieval understanding of dysentery attributed it to an imbalance of the four humors, specifically an excess of choler or black bile, or to bad air, miasmas, and divine punishment. They did not understand the concept of microscopic pathogens or the fecal-oral route of transmission. Treatments were largely ineffective and sometimes harmful. Bloodletting and purging were common as they were for many ailments, with the idea of expelling the bad humors or toxins causing the illness. Herbal remedies were used to try and slow the diarrhea or reduce fever, but none could combat the dehydration or the underlying infection. Rest and warmth were advised, but little else could be done. People often sought spiritual solace and prayer for recovery, as this was a common and terrifying killer. Records from the era frequently mention large numbers of deaths from the flux or bloody diarrhea, especially during times of warfare or famine. The constant threat of dysentery meant that every glass of water, every meal, carried a hidden risk, a stark reminder of the fragile balance between life and death in a world without proper sanitation. It was a brutal fact of life, claiming countless lives, particularly among the most vulnerable, and leaving communities reeling from its deadly impact. Number 3. Leprosy. Among the most feared and socially devastating diseases of the medieval age was leprosy, known then as Hansen's disease. This chronic bacterial infection, caused by Mycobacterium leprae, brought with it not just physical disfigurement, but also profound social ostracization. Unlike the swift dramatic death of the plague, leprosy was a slow, progressive affliction that literally consumed its victims over many years, marking them as outcasts and compelling entire communities to enact strict rules of separation. It was often viewed not just as a physical illness, but as a divine punishment, a visible sign of sin, which added immense spiritual and psychological burden to the suffering. The symptoms of leprosy were insidious and varied, often progressing slowly over many years. Early signs might be subtle, such as skin lesions that were lighter or darker than the surrounding skin, or patches that had lost sensation to touch, pain, or temperature. As the disease advanced, the damage became more pronounced. Nerve damage was a hallmark of leprosy, leading to numbness, muscle weakness, and paralysis, particularly in the hands and feet. This loss of sensation meant that sufferers might injure themselves without realizing it, leading to chronic wounds, infections, and eventually the reabsorption of bone and cartilage, causing the characteristic shortening and loss of fingers and toes. Facial disfigurement was also common with thickening of the skin, particularly on the forehead and ears, leading to a leonine appearance. The collapse of the nasal cartilage could result in a saddle nose deformity. Eyes could be affected, leading to blindness. Lumps and nodules could appear on the skin. While rarely directly fatal itself, leprosy severely weakened the body, making individuals highly susceptible to other infections, which often prove to be the ultimate cause of death. The spread of leprosy, though not fully understood even today, was thought to be primarily through prolonged close contact with an infected person, likely through respiratory droplets. However, it is not highly contagious in the way that, for example, influenza is. Most people exposed to the bacterium do not develop the disease. But in medieval society, with close living quarters and limited hygiene, opportunities for transmission certainly existed. What truly set leprosy apart was the intense fear it inspired and the severe social response it elicited. Medieval society developed elaborate rituals and laws to isolate lepers. They were often forced to wear specific clothing, like cloaks or hoods, and carry bells or clappers to announce their approach, warning others to keep their distance. They were forbidden from entering churches, markets, or other public spaces. Many were exiled from their communities and forced to live in dedicated leper colonies or isolated hospitals called lazarets or leprosaria, often situated outside city walls. These institutions, often run by religious orders, offered some form of care and shelter, but life within them was one of profound isolation. Medieval beliefs about leprosy were heavily influenced by religious texts, particularly the Old Testament, where skin diseases were often interpreted as a divine curse. This perception of leprosy as a sign of spiritual impurity or sin meant that sufferers faced not only physical deterioration, but also profound spiritual condemnation. Treatments were largely ineffective. Medieval physicians sometimes attempted various herbal remedies, balms, or purges to cleanse the body. Some even resorted to surgical removal of visible lesions, though this did little to stop the systemic progression of the disease. The primary response was prevention through isolation, which, while cruel, did perhaps limit transmission in some cases. The Church played a complex role. While enforcing separation, it also often provided care and charity for lepers through monastic orders. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, a Crusader king, famously suffered from leprosy, ruling despite his severe disfigurement, a rare example of a prominent figure enduring the disease openly. Yet even he was often shrouded or masked. Leprosy was a lifelong sentence of suffering and social death, a stark illustration of how physical illness could intertwine with spiritual beliefs and societal fear to create an almost unimaginable burden for those afflicted. It was a testament to the era's fear of the unknown and its harsh response to chronic, visible disease. Number 2. Smallpox. Among the most dreaded and devastating diseases to sweep through medieval populations was smallpox. This viral disease, characterized by a distinct widespread rash that often left survivors scarred for life, was a relentless killer. It recognized no social distinctions, striking down rich and poor, young and old, and often leaving a trail of blindness and disfigurement in its wake. Smallpox was a constant presence, flaring up in epidemics that could decimate communities, and it was a major cause of death, particularly among children. Throughout the medieval age, its terrifying ability to spread rapidly and its high mortality rate made it one of humanity's most ancient and formidable foes. The symptoms of smallpox began with a sudden onset of high fever, muscle aches, severe headaches, and often vomiting. After 2 to 4 days, the characteristic rash would appear. It started as small red spots on the face, hands, and forearms, then spread rapidly to the trunk and legs. Within a day or two, these spots would develop into fluid-filled blisters called vesicles, which then became pustules, pus-filled lesions that were deeply embedded in the skin. These pustules were often described as feeling like shot under the skin. As the pustules ripened, they became painful, itchy, and began to crust over. When the scabs eventually fell off, they left behind deep, pock-marked scars, particularly on the face, which were a lifelong brand of survival for those who survived. The physical toll was immense. Many were left blind due to lesions forming on the cornea of the eyes. Others suffered from permanent scarring, disfigurement, and sometimes limb deformities if bone infections occurred. The mortality rate was notoriously high, often reaching 30% or more in typical outbreaks, and even higher in virgin populations that had no prior exposure. The spread of smallpox was highly efficient, primarily through airborne droplets when an infected person coughed or sneezed. Direct contact with an infected person, their clothing or bedding also facilitated transmission. Smallpox was highly contagious, and a single infected individual could quickly spread the virus throughout a household or a village. The long incubation period, typically 7 to 17 days, meant that people could travel and unknowingly spread the disease before showing symptoms. Once symptoms appeared, the sick individual was often contagious for weeks until the last scab fell off. In the crowded conditions of medieval towns with frequent travel and trade, the virus found ample opportunity to move from one community to another. Children were particularly vulnerable, as few adults would have had immunity from childhood exposure. Epidemics were frequent and devastating, wiping out entire families or significantly reducing the population of towns and cities. Historical accounts often refer to pox as a common affliction. The Crusades, for example, likely played a role in spreading smallpox across different regions as soldiers and pilgrims traveled vast distances. Medieval beliefs about smallpox were like other diseases, a mix of superstition, observation, and attempts at physical treatment. It was often attributed to divine punishment, astrological influences, or imbalances of the humors. Physicians might attempt bloodletting or purging to expel the disease. Herbal remedies were used to try and reduce fever or soothe the skin. But none could stop the progression of the viral infection. Good nursing care, keeping the patient hydrated, clean, and comfortable would have been the most effective treatment, though even this was often limited. In some parts of the world, particularly in Asia, rudimentary forms of variolation, an early form of immunization where material from smallpox sores was introduced to a healthy person, were practiced, but this was generally unknown or not widely accepted in medieval Europe. People often tried to avoid the sick, but given the contagiousness and the lag time before symptoms, this was largely ineffective. Smallpox was a grim reaper, a constant specter in every medieval life, leaving a visible permanent mark on those who survived and a terrible emptiness in the lives of those who lost loved ones to its relentless assault. Its ubiquity and severity made it one of the defining scourges of the age. Number 1. Bubonic plague, Black Death. No ailment struck as much terror into the hearts of medieval people, nor caused such widespread death and societal upheaval as the bubonic plague, famously known as the Black Death. This devastating pandemic, which reached its peak in Europe between 1347 and 1351, annihilated an estimated 30% to 50% of the continent's population, profoundly reshaping its social, economic, and religious landscape. It was a terrifying, swift, and agonizing killer, arriving seemingly out of nowhere and leaving behind an unimaginable toll of death. Its microscopic cause, the Yersinia pestis bacterium, carried primarily by fleas living on rats, was utterly unknown to those who lived through its horrors. The symptoms of bubonic plague were horrifying and unmistakable. After an incubation period of typically 2 to 6 days, victims would experience a sudden onset of high fever, chills, severe headache, and overwhelming weakness. But the most distinguishing and terrifying symptom was the appearance of buboes, painfully swollen, tender lymph nodes. These swellings, often the size of an egg or an apple, appeared in the groin, armpits, or neck, areas where lymph nodes clustered. They were often blackish or purplish, giving the disease its terrifying moniker, the Black Death. The buboes would sometimes burst, oozing pus and blood. As the disease progressed, many victims also developed small black lesions on their skin due to subcutaneous hemorrhages, further contributing to the black aspect of the disease. Along with the buboes, many sufferers experienced extreme exhaustion, delirium, vomiting, and internal bleeding. Death typically occurred within a few days of symptom onset, often within 48 to 72 hours, making it a terrifyingly rapid killer. While bubonic plague was the most common form, the bacterium could also cause other, even deadlier forms. Pneumonic plague directly affected the lungs, causing severe coughing, often with bloody sputum, and was highly contagious, spreading directly from person to person through respiratory droplets, without the need for fleas or rats. Septicemic plague occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream, leading to widespread infection, often without the appearance of buboes, causing rapid death from septic shock. These forms contributed to the rapid and devastating spread of the pandemic. The spread of the Black Death was primarily facilitated by infected fleas living on black rats, which were ubiquitous in medieval towns and ships. As rats died from the plague, the fleas would seek new hosts, including humans. Once on a human, an infected flea would bite, transmitting the bacteria. The plague traveled along trade routes, carried by ships and caravans. From its likely origins in Central Asia, it moved westward through the Silk Road, reaching the Mediterranean ports in 1347. From there, it spread rapidly across Europe, its movement aided by the dense populations in towns and cities and the constant movement of people and goods. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and the general prevalence of rats and fleas created ideal conditions for the plague to thrive. People did not understand the role of rats or fleas, nor did they understand the concept of contagion. They attributed the plague to divine wrath, astrological conjunctions, bad air, miasmas, or even Jewish conspiracies. The societal impact of the Black Death was catastrophic and unprecedented. With millions dying, agriculture collapsed in many areas, leading to famine. Trade routes were disrupted and economies plummeted. Entire villages were wiped out. The massive death toll led to severe labor shortages, which paradoxically eventually improved the bargaining power of surviving peasants, contributing to the decline of feudalism in some regions. Social order broke down in many places, with mass burials, desperate acts of piety, flagellant movements, and persecution of minorities. Physicians and healers were powerless. Their remedies like bloodletting, purging, or applying poultices to buboes were utterly ineffective. Many believed the only hope was prayer and repentance. Cities attempted desperate measures like quarantine, sometimes burning houses of the infected. But these were often too little, too late. The Black Death was not a one-time event. It returned in subsequent waves for centuries, though none were as devastating as the initial 14th century pandemic. Its memory cast a long, dark shadow over the medieval age, a constant reminder of humanity's vulnerability to unseen forces and the fragility of life.